Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining Game Theory's Ask the Expert session. My name is Claudia Sistini, and I'm the Global CMO at Game Theory. For those of you who are not familiar with Game Theory, we are a global marketing effectiveness consultancy that helps marketers make better decisions via advanced analytics and data. So being part of WPP means that we have a lot of marketing and media expertise, but we also help our clients make decisions around scenario planning and pricing and forecasting. So kind of going really beyond the marketing and comms sphere. Pre-pandemic, we used to host a lot of dinners and lunches, and obviously the hope is that that'll be back very soon. And the idea with those lunches and dinners was to bring marketers together in a community to talk about marketing effectiveness in a very informal and conversational style, and that's very much the spirit in which we are hosting the session today. We have brought together a couple of our experts at Game Theory to hopefully answer some of your questions around marketing effectiveness. The format will be that we will start off with 3 questions that we've been receiving from clients in a fireside chat with our experts today, so John Webb and Matt Chappell. And you'll be able to ask any questions that you want via the chat functionality. So we'll check into the chat and sort of throw those questions over at our experts. Again, you can, we're doing this in a very sort of informal and conversational style. So if you want to throw your question anonymously, please do. Feel free as well to use your name. So we're going to start off with some introductions to our experts, and I'm going to start with John Webb. So John, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, what you do at Game Theory, and perhaps give us a silver lining or something positive that's been coming out of the these uncertain times. Over to you, John.
Hi, Claudia. Hi, everybody. I'm managing partner at Game Theory, and I lead marketing effectiveness and general business consultancy programs with our clients, specializing mainly in retail, financial services and CPG, but also tech and pharma as well. Silver linings are quite hard to find at the moment. I think actually I was pretty reassured when governments in most of the Western world, and obviously a little bit further afield as well, announced a range of measures to protect incomes in as much as they can. Obviously, some programs are more generous than others, and some countries are doing better than others. But maintaining that level of income for the majority of the population is a great move, and has helped to stabilize the situation as much as it can do. I think on a personal note as well, a great silver lining for me is I'm seeing a lot more of my family, although I'm kind of hopeful that none of us will see them for the next hour.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, John. Now over to you, Matt, a quick introduction into yourself, what you do at Game Theory, and again, any positives or silver linings that are coming out for you at the moment.
Thank you, Claudia. So my name is Matt Chappell. I have been doing marketing effectiveness for about 11 years now. And like John, I lead client relationships across a number of different sectors. I've got particular focus on short versus long term, and I think we'll be talking a bit about that through today's session. But silver linings for me primarily have been around, we've seen a kind of return to more nature. So whether that be clear waters in Venice or whether that be goats on the streets of Welsh villages, it's been a really good time to see nature come back, and maybe it's going to be an adjustment of how kind of human beings and the rest of the world can work actually properly together. So that's been a big silver lining for me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Matt. Right, so into the first question. So obviously these times have been a massive stress test for many marketers. Government restrictions have meant that, you know, there's been an impact on distribution, supply, you know, product and service availability. So the question would be, what questions should marketers be asking right now to help inform business decisions? What are those questions? John, I'm going to throw that one to you.
Sure, thanks, Claudia. I think the first thing to say on that is that marketers should wear a much wider hat or a broader hat than they have done in the past. It's not just about media, it's not just about the latest marketing communications campaign. It's thinking more about where the whole company is, sitting down with finance, working out what the cash flow is like, whether advertising can be afforded, whether it even makes sense to advertise now. I mean, we know that companies that advertise during recessions and periods of crisis, we know that those tend to come out more stronger than, or more strongly than their competitors. But I think you can't just focus, marketing can't just focus on pure marketing issues. It's got to be much wider than that. And I think it's sitting down and coming up with plans. So we know where we were. We know that in the first 2 or 3 weeks of the pandemic, we had to concentrate on logistics. We had to make sure supply chains were in place. We had to make sure that orders that were made could be fulfilled and delivered to our customers, primarily through an online communications channel. We had to make sure all of those things were in place, and that's largely been done now. Now it's more about thinking about the future, and do we expect the almost inevitable economic turmoil to be a V-shaped recession with a fairly steep decline but quick recovery, or whether it's going to be slightly lengthier than that. And I think context is key as well. So understand where your brand is, understand what your brand promises, what your brand values are, but primarily where you want your brand to be in 3 months' time, 6 months' time, and a year's time, and then work back from there. So we work with auto brands, for example, across Europe, across the globe actually, and I guess there's not a lot of traffic into dealerships at the moment, but one thing would be to consider, as we're coming out of the lockdown phase, do we want to start advertising in advance of that? Should we advertise as the lockdown eases? Do we want to be promoting expensive top of the range cars, or is it cheaper, more basic versions? And if it is top of the range, which elements of top of the range are we concentrating on? So there's a whole host of things, but primarily the role is tactical and strategic, and strategic at the moment is really key, because you've got to understand where you want to be in a year's time and how we're going to get there, and start putting those plans in place now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, John. I think some really great questions that marketers should be asking for the now, but also kind of getting themselves prepared for the coming months and sort of longer term. So again, a reminder, more than happy to take any questions. Please use the chat functionality. So over to the second question that we're receiving from clients and the marketing community, the wider marketing community. I guess I'll start by saying that the last recession is probably the closest analogous scenario to be applied to the tough times that we find ourselves in. Harvard Business Review is quoted to have said that brands that increase or maintain spend during tough times are able to improve their market share and return on investment at the other end at a lower cost than if they sort of stopped advertising altogether. So Matt, I'm going to throw this one to you, because I know you're a very well-respected voice on this topic, having done a lot of research with the likes of ThinkBox on the short and long-term impacts of advertising. So the question we're getting is, you know, what's the impact of me stopping advertising altogether or curtailing certain campaigns during this session? I'm going to throw that over to you, Matt.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I think we definitely need to be thinking about this in terms of short and long, and probably the medium as well term, so short, medium and long term. In a lot of cases, there are difficult decisions being made about what to do with advertising for the here and now. And there are a lot of advertisers who don't have budgets. There are a lot of advertisers who are seeing a surplus of demand and therefore wouldn't want to prompt any more demand because they're kind of struggling to keep up with fulfilling that demand. And John, talked about that in the previous question. But I think it's also important to look beyond just what's happening here and now. It's not just about prompting demand in the here and now, and it's also about thinking to that medium, thinking to that long term. And there's 3 reasons why advertising now for the long term is important. So number 1 is we do see that habits can change when there are big shifts in consumer lifestyles or life stages. So if people get married or have kids or move home, that's normally when you start to see big changes in their consumption patterns happening. And really, the COVID-19, the lockdown, spending more time with your children, having more meals, having different ways of accessing goods and services is a massive life-changing moment for everyone. And as advertisers, if we do have budgets and if we do have products and services that fit that new need, then this is the perfect time to be looking to fulfill that demand and getting ahead of consumers changing their habits and adding into that. The next 2 are about how then advertising impact can work over the long term. So the first one is the fact that in the study that Claudia mentioned just now, so thank you for that, Claudia, that we did with ThinkBox, we found that advertising had twice as much of an effect in the long term as it did when you just look at the short term. So it's important that you're taking into account what might happen in the years and months ahead, because that impact will either be there if you advertise or it won't be if you don't. And if you don't advertise, then you can guarantee that there could be other, your competitors in your sector that are advertising now and building that long-term impact ahead of you. And it could be a really bad way to be losing share of market as we go through that period. So you need to take into account that your advertising could be having a long-term impact, is likely to be having a long-term impact, and that if you lose out on that now, you're going to lose out on that forever. I think the third thing to bear in mind, and similar to what John was saying, was the fact that we don't know when this lockdown is going to end, but what we do know is that brands who try to run from a standing start are much worse off and have to spend much more money than brands who are trying to run with their communications from a walking start. So it's going to be a lot easier if you have a base level of investment, maybe focusing on your brand communications, on solidifying that in consumers' minds, that you can then run from when the lockdown is lifted, as opposed to going completely dark, not doing any advertising, and then as soon as the lockdown's lifted, having to pump loads more money back into your advertising to build things like reach, coverage, and salience with that. So, if I were to summarize, that last point is you want to be running from a walking start, not a standing start. The second point I made was that advertising does have a long-term impact. That's been proven. And that if you stop advertising now, you're going to lose that long-term impact, and that just won't come back. And the first reason is that now is actually a fantastic opportunity to be building habits as people's life cycles and life stages are going through this fundamental shift. So all 3 of those reasons give a good reason not to go dark and a good reason to be positive about advertising's long-term impact.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matt. So I suppose the third question that we're getting a lot of is around, the reality is many businesses at the moment are having to either scrap marketing budget, to sort of save the business in many instances as cost reductions sort of kicked in, or they're having to really reduce marketing budget. So for those who are, I guess I would say, lucky enough to still be able to invest in marketing. We're getting a lot of questions on how do I optimize that media budget? What should I be cutting back on? What should I be amping up on? And John, I'm going to throw this one to you. What's your advice around media investment at the moment if people do need to cut back?
Yeah, thanks, Claudia. Just going to step back for a second on Matt's answer, because Matt actually referenced some interesting research, and if you just drop a line into the chat, we'll see if we can send that research on if anybody's interested. So that was a behavioural economics, Matt, I think the research came from.
Yes, so there's a whole bunch of behavioural economics research that shows that people are more likely to change their habits at times when their life is changing and where they're going through different life stages. So yeah, absolutely, you can share that. And it was really interesting reading for me as we go through what is an absolutely life-changing scenario.
Yeah, so I think that presents another opportunity for marketers at the moment. Sorry, Claudia, to get back to your question, what media and which media channels, I guess. I mean, I think the answer to that, obviously there have been some changes with demand for different media channels, and I guess we all know that out of home and cinema advertising is probably on a downward path over the COVID sort of lockdown period. But I think the real answer to that hasn't changed. I mean, the real question we're asking is, how do I best meet my objectives with media and marketing? And the way we would go about that hasn't actually changed. The fundamentals remain the same. I think we need to know what our KPI is, and you could perhaps argue that at this time we need to have a laser-like focus on the KPI, and rather than go for maybe multiple KPIs from a marketing campaign, we should probably just focus on one. For most of our clients out there, it's unlikely to be immediate sales revenue. It's more likely to be based around still pretty hard measures, but a little bit softer, and perhaps a couple of stages removed from the final sales purchase, but maybe top 2 box consideration, for example, or brand awareness for some of the smaller brands. But concentrate on a single KPI, really understand what success looks like, understand what that KPI is, and focus on that. Understand what your audience is, and I don't necessarily just mean a media audience. Are you going for existing customers, or are you trying to win new customers, widen the customer base? Existing customers can be hit by CRM programs where they exist. New customers, I don't think anything's changed there. Broadcast is still the most efficient way of achieving that. Now, obviously, for most retailers outside of grocery, online shopping is the way to go. And I guess everybody would have read the news stories about Jeff Bezos adding to his fortune, and Amazon definitely winning over this period. You know, online shopping is here to stay, and it's definitely taken a leap forward over this period. So understand who your customers are, excuse me, understand your audience, understand how to reach that audience. And then the media really flows directly from that. For most of our clients, TV is a great way of reaching a new audience and communicating a quite strong upper funnel message. So talking about the overall saliency of the brand, whether it's right for you at the moment or whether it's for the future. And then other media are more useful at almost closing the deal. They're much more useful further down the funnel. So PPC, for example, is obviously a powerful, you know, channel in its own right. But at the moment, given that most retailers are pivoting to an online model, PPC is absolutely vital. Now, yes, for sure, control CPMs and make sure the costs don't accelerate, because a lot of people will be going towards the same media strategy. So look at it carefully. But I would say the two elements of the media mix that definitely need to be considered are TV, partly because costs are coming down as people pull out, and search, because it will get people direct to your website so that you can sell to them. And then the audience, look at who your audience for the other media. In some cases, radio is great. In some cases, print is great. In many cases, display is great. but know your audience and know what you're trying to achieve. And the fundamentals haven't changed.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
If I can maybe jump in, Claudia, is that all right?
Sure, go ahead.
Great. So I think, yeah, just to add to that point, John was talking very much about the costs as advertisers pull out of certain channels, but we also need to look at where the audience is as well. So TV and broadcast VOD have both seen huge double-digit annual increases in audiences. So TV's been up between 20 and 30% as more people are staying at home and watching TV in the evening, but also during the day as people are furloughed and not able to work. And exactly the same with broadcast VOD as people catch up on their favorite shows. So there's a double impact there where you're seeing reduced costs because advertisers are pulling out where they don't have the money to invest, but also increased supply in terms of number of eyeballs watching those ads. And I think the other channel to mention is social. So we're also seeing a big rise in the number of people using Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, and all of the different social channels, and you know, they could be a great place to catch eyeballs, especially if you're looking at people towards the lower age ranges, you know, people in the teens, 20s and 30s as well.
Harder to reach with traditional media as well.
Absolutely.
It's almost like a double act.
Oh, fantastic. So as we wait for any questions coming in, and I would remind everybody, more than happy to answer any questions you have, just throw them on the chat. You can do so anonymously if you don't want to share your name or where you're from. A question for either one of you really around creative messaging and execution. Obviously, sort of there's a lot of talk about now being the right time to show your sense of purpose. Some brands obviously repurposing their business to help with the fight against COVID, and you know, whether they're sort of producing masks or hand sanitizer, or sort of really helping key workers at this stage, and other brands sort of really kind of almost fine-tuning their purpose and creative messaging. What's the right way to go? I guess I'm going to throw this to Matt actually first, and then perhaps get John's point of view on creative messaging and execution.
I dodged a bullet there.
So I guess there are a few questions just for clarity, Claudia. You're asking what the best way to repurpose creative is?
Yes, I think what's the best creative message for now, whether that's repurposing or carrying on with what you had previously.
Cool, gotcha. Thank you very much. Thank you for the clarity. I think there are two key things that we need to be looking at in terms of creative messaging. So again, if I go back to some of the analysis we've done on what makes for effective messaging, we do know that consistency and persisting with similar creative themes can be a really strong driver of ROI, both in the short and long term. So if we think of really strong creative vehicles, you know, there's been a lot of press within the grocery industry in the UK about Tesco and their love stories, food love stories, Aldi carrying on like brands for the last 10 to 15 years and having those really strong creative threads that have gone over years and even decades. Because we know that there's that strong link between consistency and driving ROI, then that's not something, you know, that's something we should be considering very heavily before we pivot to any new creative style. So, you know, if you're an advertiser who does have that strong style of creative, then think about that carefully. But obviously the other big thing at the moment is relevance and the willingness not to appear tone deaf to what's going on. So I think if you can combine the two, so make something that's relevant to what's going on right now with a creative vehicle that you've been using and that consumers are familiar with, then you'll really be onto a winner. But you know, obviously that's the holy grail, because you have to be using something that works and can be repurposed to work for today's world.
Should I?
Yes, please go ahead, John.
Add a couple of things. I mean, we are by no means a creative agency, but just a couple of little anecdotes, I suppose, from our clients. Some of them have recut their video ads to make sure that, you know, any hugging or handshakes are removed over this period. So, I mean, I guess that goes back to where Matt said, don't be tone deaf. You know, if the advice is to maintain social distancing, then reflect that in your communications. I think also there will be a temptation to pivot. And I think Matt was absolutely right in saying, if you've got a consistent tone and a consistent style, persist with that unless you've got good reason to change. But if you do introduce tweaks, I don't want to turn this into, you know, a come to gain theory, because we've got lots of different solutions, but there are near term or not quite real time data solutions where creative tweaks or changes to execution can be very quickly evaluated in a very rigorous sense, both in terms of the impact on things like consideration awareness, as well as hard sales numbers. So whilst we might not be best placed to advise on the creative style, we can certainly evaluate how creative tweaks have worked in the marketplace. Thanks, Claudia.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, John. So I do have a question from somebody in the audience today who works in an industry that has been heavily affected. So the travel industry, budgets and campaigns having been cut. What is the advice on the effect of this approach, i.e. but cutting back budgets and campaigns, and also advice on when and how to restart normal advertising? So this kind of goes back to a little bit about what you were saying, Matt, short and long-term effects. So the travel industry, obviously being, you know, really one of the biggest victims of the COVID in business terms, cutting back on advertising or just not advertising at all. You know, what is the impact of that? But how should they get back to normal once we're at the other end? Matt, I'm going to throw that at you. That's it.
Great. No worries. It's a really tough one, because at the moment, obviously, we just don't know when, for example, you know, leisure flying will be allowed back, when holidays will be allowed back. There was just a news today that said that social distancing is going to have to be in place until we have a vaccine, and we know that's going to be a while off. So, you know, we are talking long term about this, and it also depends on cash flow. And I know a lot of people within the travel industry have been having significant cash flow problems, and there might just be an affordability problem. But what we would say is we need to be there, and we need to be advertising when that demand starts to pick up. So, for example, could it be for late winter holidays in 2021? Could it be for summer holidays during 21? And getting ahead of the curve on that, but at the same time being aware of any supply restrictions that might exist, any demand as well, because if we're going through a recession, that's going to cut travel back as well. So again, it comes back to, you know, what is your brand? What were you advertising before? Can you carry a consistent brand message? Can you carry a consistent brand message through your communication? And thinking about when the time to start again could be based on when we think demand might be starting to pick up. So we'd probably be talking Q4 this year to start really bringing that back on board, to then get ahead of the game. And I think the other thing is being aware of, you know, first mover advantage. So as travel picks up, you don't want to be the third or the fourth, you know, company getting back onto advertising. You want to be ahead of the game, but balancing off that kind of when demand's picking up, when cash flow's there, when we think restrictions are going to be lifted, and therefore kind of Q4 this year, Q1 next year would be probably the best advice. without doing any further kind of in-depth analysis. But I am also do want to also hear what John has to say about this as well.
Yeah, it's a very complicated area, and it's and even just say the travel sector, obviously there are differences within that. So I think I saw on the news the other day that the German government has made a grant to TUI, obviously not a carrier, but a package holiday sort of company to keep them afloat. So, and there have been various requests from the carriers in the UK and no doubt other countries as well for support from the government. The issue there, I guess, is where that support is offered, what strings are attached, and is marketing. I mean, I know the government in the UK has a fairly healthy and modern perspective on advertising. They do quite a lot of it. But whether governments in other countries adopt the same approach and sort of bailouts in inverted commas, to go back to the last recession, if bailouts are made, will those organisations actually be allowed to market? But that's paid marketing, right? Every company has owned media channels, whether that be your own website, whether that be your own Facebook page, whether that be your YouTube page or Instagram or whatever. There is an awful lot that can be done on owned media. Now, okay, owned media, you're talking to the converted, you're talking largely to your existing customers or people who are close to being customers, but those are key people. You don't want to lose those people. If you lose those people, as Matt said, new habits are formed in periods like this. If you lose those people now, will you get them back? Well, maybe, but how much will it actually cost to get them back? So I know we've been on a few websites within this sector. We know largely over the last few weeks that there've been more public sector and public service announcements around, we'll do our best to get you back for people who are already overseas and need to get back to the UK or their country of origin. And I think it's time most of those people are back now. So perhaps over the next couple of weeks, it's time to pivot away from that and go into more, on your owned properties that cost you very little other than creative design. On those owned properties, start marketing in a very tentative sense, because again, as Matt said, we just don't know where we're going to be either with demand or with supply at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. If I can build on it, just personally speaking, I'm signed up to emails with at least 3 different airlines. So I'm definitely a target for some of the own communications. But to build on one of John's points he made right at the start, it's not just about paid media, it's not just about owned media, but it's also about other parts of marketing. So now gives you also an excellent opportunity to start thinking about pricing, proposition, your product experience, your consumer experience, website, UX, all of this kind of thing, where with less demand and with less need to be getting people from A to B on a daily basis, you could actually step back and think about that, so that when we do get back to normal, you've got a much better proposition, a much better user experience than you might have done before it, because this gives you a great great moment to be able to step back and think about all of that stuff without having to churn out comms every week in a paid media sense, as you would be possibly doing it at normal times.
Fantastic.
And we know that experience is key now for a huge demographic with high disposable income. So it's likely to become even more important. Yeah, great point, Matt.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, both. I guess one more sort of question to ask you both on that topic, in terms of perhaps some other sectors, perhaps the CPG sector at the moment, where there might be, and this could apply actually to any sector, where there might be an instance of forced trials. So, brand loyalty potentially being, really heavily questioned at the moment, or stress tested. So in the instance where I might be very brand loyal to a product pre pre-COVID or Corona, I am then sort of forced to trial a new product, whether it's because of my own personal financial situation or because of availability, issues with demand or supply. Any thoughts on the impact of forced trials during COVID and how some brands can perhaps maintain the loyalty that they had pre-COVID?
Shall I go first?
Sure, go ahead, John.
I think I'm probably a little bit of a disciple of Byron Sharp on this one. Probably the only time, for people who know me well, the only time you'll ever hear me say this. I think this is not true for every CPG category, for sure, but for many CPG categories, I think there's a huge number of repertoire buyers and a very small pool of loyal buyers who will always seek to buy, this brand and no other brand. So I think whilst the impact you're describing is real, in the sense that a number of brands have temporarily been off the shelf in grocers, I think in most parts of Western Europe and North America, that's probably only been the case for 2 or 3 weeks. There may have been an awful amount of pantry stocking and panic buying in various well-known categories that we don't need to go into, but I think for the most part, I can't think of many brands that I've not been able to get personally over the last couple of weeks. And I think most people are repertoire buyers anyway. Now, where somebody has been forced to shift, will they go back to the original? Will they go back to the original brand that they were buying? I think that's more open to question. And the honest answer is we just don't know yet, because we haven't seen the data flows that will really cover this period. I think it's an interesting question, and we'll wait to see the data. But I know whenever I've worked in CPG and I've looked at the switching analysis, the data that shows how consumers move from SKU to SKU, brand to brand, there is, clearly in that data, just a cursory examination of that data will show a huge number of repertoire buyers. And I think people buy from a pool, people buy on deal, people buy on shelf shouting and positioning as much as anything else.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. I think there's going to be 2 big moments for this. So the first one will be when we are back to normal, how much will working from home persist as something that people do more often? So, we could be in a situation where people decide that they're actually going to work 2 or 3 days from home and only go into the office 2 or 3 days, and working from home is a bit more of a new normal. And the reason I bring that up in terms of CPG is we have seen a big rise in direct consumer categories where they're bypassing retailers and going straight into, delivering straight into people's homes. Personally, I bought a 24-pack of beer directly from a small beer producer in Bermondsey in London, but rather than go through any retailers. And the reason I can do that is because I'm at home all the time. So it's really easy to get to me with deliveries when it wouldn't be, when I'm doing my 9 to 5 and commuting into work. So when we do go back to normal and when people start going back into the office more and more, or back to their place of work, it will be interesting to see whether some of that direct consumer delivery persists. I think the other thing that's interesting is the massive reduction in impulse buying that's happening. So I've mentioned beer, I'm going to mention chocolate. The fact that when you're doing your weekly shop now, because you're only allowed out technically once per week to do your shop, are you more likely to buy a multi-pack of Kit Kats than in the past you might have bought a Kit Kat on Monday and a Mars bar on Tuesday and maybe even something else on Wednesday? So there's a really interesting thing about switching there and people being forced into that kind of multi-pack purchase, and whether that invokes any lasting behavior in terms of individuals. I mean, like John says, we can hypothesize at the moment. We can play out different scenarios, and I think that's probably a general bit of advice anyway through the current time period, is none of us will know exactly what's going to happen, but the best we can do is, do what if scenarios, do hypotheses, and try and get to our best knowledge of what's going on. And I think that's going to be a really solid approach to take us through the coming weeks and months.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thank you, Matt. I've got another question come in, and I'm going to read it out loud here. I'd like some advice on running existing brand campaigns during coronavirus, or should we be pausing any brand campaign that does not make reference to the virus, i.e. quickly adapting or creating new campaigns? Can you offer an opinion on what consumers expect during this period? So, brand campaign not to do with coronavirus, or should they be switching to something more specific to the here and now? Is there a consumer expectation?
I don't.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, John, you go.
Yeah, okay. Mine will be fairly. I don't, like most consumers, know that a virus is there, right? I don't think we need to tell them about the virus in our messaging or communications. So, unless there is a particular reason to mention it in the campaign, I could see it maybe if you're selling soap or hand sanitizers or something like that. But I think there's a big risk of being perceived as opportunistic with the kind of approach where you mention COVID-19. I'm not. Without really knowing the category or more details, it's hard to comment. But the purpose of a brand campaign is to emphasize your brand values and the proposition, the parts of your product or service that differentiate you from the competitors, and to give consumers a reason to buy your brand. I don't, again, without knowing the details, it's hard to be specific. But I'd be wary of changing the creative to make overt reference or to try and make overt gain from the virus that's out there.
Yeah, and I think it does depend on the channel, but we're still in a perspective where most large advertisers' brand campaigns are built around TV, and with TV viewership going up through this period, that still seems like a sensible thing to be doing. And actually, my, again, personal opinion, and as I tell my analysts, data is not the plural of anecdote, but anecdotal opinion is that I actually, when I watch TV, I want a bit of escapism. I don't want to be, when I'm watching the news, yes, I want to see what's going on, and I'm watching that for a very specific reason. But if I'm watching a drama or a comedy, I want that escapism, and it's quite nice to see that there was a world before, and there are people who are shaking hands and hugging and doing all of the stuff we're currently not allowed to do. And I think if all of the advertising is then about coronavirus, if it's about social distancing or hand sanitizing, it's a bit of a slap back to reality, when in actual fact, it might be good to keep that escapism and stay with the formatting of the programming. Now, the reason I mentioned channel, because obviously that's the case in TV. If we come to maybe social or online, and something contextual or something that feeds into what's being talked about on that platform. So, if everyone on Instagram is talking about doing their 5K or going on their walk or being stuck in earlier as well, we do definitely see benefits from consistency. So advertisers who run more consistent, long-lasting brand campaigns are those advertisers who get much better short and long-term ROIs from their media.
Brilliant. And I couldn't agree more, Matt, in terms of advertising offering the escapism at the moment. I suppose the one thing to bear in mind would be to, kind of strike a good balance and be aware of not sort of being perceived as tone deaf with some of the creative executions that may be sort of contextually now not the right thing to say. But three cheers to keeping morale up. We certainly don't want to be constantly bombarded with news and content about corona. So, you know, there's a massive role at the moment for brands to play from a perspective of cheerleading the nation, brand purpose, keeping morale up and high. And so creativity, of course, is really, really important right now. And I think a form of escapism for many consumers across various platforms. So fantastic. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Matt and John. Appreciate you taking the time. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in and asking fantastic questions. We will be hosting this session on a weekly basis, so please reach out to Andy Oliver if you want to join again and you have any questions beforehand. We can always address them live or on a one-to-one basis. But in the meantime, stay safe, stay well, and thank you very much, John and Matt, for your time today. And we will speak to everybody very soon.